Good morning, everybody, and first of all, thank you for sticking around for our panel this morning. I know on a beautiful morning like this in Vail, it's pretty tempting to go out and go for a bike ride or a hike, but thanks for sticking with us. I'm Brent Newman with the Water Conservation Board. I'm the chief of the Interstate, Federal, and Water Information section of the CWCB staff. Over the past couple of days here in Vail, we've heard some really good discussion on Colorado River issues. On Wednesday, we had a very well-attended workshop, which took a look at the various entities which participate actively in river management discussions, be those state agencies, interstate commissions, conservation and conservancy districts, or NGOs. As all of our candidates for office have come in here and spoken with the membership, each one of them has mentioned Colorado River issues and the management of that river and variable hydrology as an issue of utmost importance. And yesterday, Director Mitchell and I had the opportunity to talk to the Interim Water Resources Review Committee about compact compliance in the Colorado River and drought planning efforts in the Colorado River Basin. On this panel today, we're going to examine how the poor hydrologic conditions on the Colorado River can impact local planning efforts here in Colorado. Then we're going to take a look at the potential challenges and opportunities that ongoing drought planning efforts present for our Colorado water users. I think most of the folks in the audience are going to be familiar with our panel up here, but I'm going to read some quick bios anyway. Bruce Whitehead here in the gray coat, third from my left, is the executive director of the Southwest Water Conservation District based in Durango. In the evenings, he dons a pair of black ears and a cape, and he uses his utility belt and an array of super cool gadgets to rid Gotham City of criminal masterminds. Lee Miller, on the end, is the general counsel for Southeastern Colorado Water Conservancy District. After he arrived on Earth from his home planet of Krypton, he was imbued with superhuman powers, including flight and super strength. One of these days, he'll put Lex Luthor behind bars. Lane Leoniak, to my left, is an assistant attorney general in the Federal Interstate Water Unit of the Colorado Attorney General's Office. She is the daughter of Zeus and the Amazon queen Hippolyta. She uses her lasso of truth to keep Arizona water utilities honest, and her invisible airplane to travel around the West and participate in drought planning efforts. Andy Mueller is the general manager of the Colorado River Water Conservation District. Andy. You wouldn't like Andy when he's angry. He turns green and triples in size and fights evil with his superhuman strength and his chilling war cry, Andy Smash. So we're going to start today's panel with the very creative way that we did on Wednesday. We're going to ask an attorney to provide us an overview of hydrologic conditions on the river.
Thank you, Brent. There you go. Thank you, Brent. I was asked to provide an overview. I am a lawyer, but I do love to pretend that I am a hydrologist and a water engineer. So thank you. I think the best way to get a good overview of the hydrology of the Colorado River as a whole is to look at the upper basin and specifically reflected in inflows into Lake Powell. That is really the key metric that the Bureau of Reclamation and water users and decision makers rely on to make decisions and take action. So this chart that I think has been presented previously, I don't know if it's up on the screen. I don't know if we could get that up. It was presented earlier in the Congress and has been referred to a few times, but I think it's always good to take a look at this again. If you look at the average total water year inflows into Powell, between 1981 and 2010, it's 10.83 million acre feet. But 14, and really looking at the hydrology since 2000 is key here because it is unprecedented. So in 14 of the last 19 of those years, the total inflow has been below average. And the Bureau of Reclamation is anticipating that 2019 will also be below average. It's important to keep in mind that most of these inflows occur during a very short period of time between April and July. And so of that 10.83 total year average, the April through July inflow average is 7.16 million acre feet, and that occurs during that 4-month window. But 9 of the last 19 years for April through July inflow has been below 5 million acre feet. So not just below average, but a fair bit below average. 3 of the 4 lowest years on record have occurred in this period, and then the driest 2-year consecutive period also occurred during this period in 2012 and 2013. As of August 13th of this year, Lake Powell was 49% full with a volume of 11.84 million acre feet and an elevation of 3,600 feet above sea level. It's projected in 2019 to be 38 feet lower than it was in January of 2018. I think that the takeaway from this hydrology is that we are not going to be able to rely on the historical hydrology that occurred before 2000 to make decisions going forward. I think the hydrology makes clear that water users and decision makers like those sitting beside me and those of you in this room, that this is not an upper basin problem or a lower basin problem, but this is a Colorado River system problem. And that hydrology is driving efforts for these folks to set their differences aside and work together to find solutions to keep Lake Powell from reaching critical elevations before 2026.
Thank you, Lane. So over the past couple of days, we've heard from our various panels about the physical impacts of drought to our water users and communities. We've had these record low stream flows around the state, devastating wildfires, calls on the river. The impacts of drought to local water users and stakeholders are pretty obvious, but for water managers and planners like the ones we have on our panel, I'd like to explore the impacts of long-term sustained drought for this meaningful resource planning. This first question is for Lee. The Voluntary Flow Management Program in the Arkansas Basin is a good model of success for planning in the face of variable conditions. Even in a hydrologically challenging year like this, the Arkansas was able to continue providing recreational opportunities in the upper Ark area while still sustaining agriculture along the river. Have your stakeholders in Southeastern's area expressed more interest in similar programs or expressed support for the continuance of the flow program, considering these benefits realized? And sort of what considerations must the district and your partners take into account to ensure the continued success of such a program?
Thank you, Brett. Is this on? Okay, everyone's, okay, sounds like it. Okay, this was a really interesting year for the Voluntary Flow Management Program on the Arkansas because we started the year with an extremely full Pueblo Reservoir. And one of the operational issues that we have is that we have to lower the level of Pueblo Reservoir to accommodate the flood pool, the Army Corps of Engineers flood control limits. And so we were actually asking water users to use water early to take it out of the reservoir. So when we then moved water from the upper reservoirs down to Pueblo Reservoir to help with the Voluntary Flow Management Program in the upper basin of the Arkansas, we had a lot of our water users going, hey, wait a second, you just made us move water out. You made us use water early, and now you're going to fill Pueblo Reservoir up again by moving this water down. So there was a lot of consternation in some places that we have. You know, the flow management program for a lot of people is, it's always been there on the Arkansas River, and they're very comfortable with it. In fact, some of the recreational industry kind of assumes that it's all in a, the way that it's always going to be. I mean, one of the issues that we have is this program started, well, it was a result of actually litigation between recreationalists. We had the infamous Roe v. Wade, the fishermen versus the rafters. And so this all resulted as part of that. The ag users and reclamation kind of like, this is your problem. But ultimately, people came together to try and find a solution. But in the early years, we renewed the program every year. And right now, we still only have a 5 to 6 year program. So it's not set in stone. But what we have had is that as time's gone on, people have become more comfortable with the program. And except in unusual years like this, really, we don't hear a lot about it. And in fact, we had some really wonderful things happen this year. So the reclamation in Southeastern try and move about 10,000 acre feet down from the upper reservoirs into Pueblo Reservoir during the rafting season to help with that. We were asked to do some more. We added another about 3,000 acre feet above the 10,000 that were committed. We also had extremely good support from some of the other partners on the rivers. Pueblo Water has participated in moving their water. All we're doing is moving water. We're timing the operations. Those have been very good. And for the first time this year in the entire history of the Voluntary Flow Management Program, Colorado Springs Utilities also moved water from the upper reservoirs to Pueblo Reservoir to help support it. So we've got really good institutional support for it. But we always have to remember that it's, all these programs are only 1 year from failure. And so we have to remember, we got to keep telling the story, we got to keep supporting the basis. We can't just assume everyone understands why this is a good thing. We have to continue to tell the story. Chris Woodka on our staff has done a really good job in the last couple of years trying to help remind people, how did we get here? Because, in the Arkansas Basin, we've been very good at experimenting to try and get there. That's how we got the winter water storage program. That's how, we've got innovators in the basin sometimes that cause consternation with the ATMs. The basin came together to come up with what we call the accounting tool, or the administrative tool, and to try and make it easier for ATMs to work. Way back, in 2002, the Arkansas Basin had the first water bank pilot program. It failed. We had to be willing to fail. And quite frankly, it failed because it had two stages in the mind of the person who implemented it. One was to set up what was really a water exchange. The other one was to fund some of the activities of the water exchange. Well, that's one of those issues that, keeps coming back. We didn't get the money to do that. So the Arkansas Basin is still looking at new and innovative ways to work together. I think we're one of the more collaborative basins in the state. But it's a struggle. You always have to struggle.
Thank you, Lee. The next question is for Bruce. As the Southwestern Board is confronted directly with a major reduction in water supplies in both the San Juan and Dolores basins, and you've had the impacts of wildfires this year, especially in a year of exceptional drought, has that shifted priorities or focus for the Southwestern Board, and how has the normal course of business changed for you guys over the past couple of years?
Thanks, Brent. It's quite a question. There's a lot of things within that question. We talked a little bit yesterday about the drought conditions we're seeing, and we could probably have the next hour to talk about that truthfully. But a couple things just to recap from yesterday. We've been in D4 drought conditions really since we've had a forecast of 52%, or our peak snowpack was 52%. And we've been in the bullseye in southwest Colorado all year, and it really hasn't changed. We haven't had really a great monsoon pattern that has shaped up yet. And so there's a reduction in supplies that people are seeing throughout the basin. Our basin is a little bit different than a lot of the other main stem type river basins, where we have individual rivers that generally flow from north to south, tributary to the San Juan River, and that's the San Juan, Piedra, Pine, Florida, Animas, La Plata, Mancos, and then with the exception of the Dolores, it actually heads south and then curves back to the north and is tributary to the Colorado River. But all of them have suffered some of the same conditions, and they're administered separately from each other, except for the potential compact administration. But within all those basins, there are water users that normally would have a decent water supply in good years, maybe even into August, and some of them got nothing. Our stream flows were 20 to 30% of normal. We peaked on all the rivers about 10th of May, and which is much earlier than we normally have. Again, I don't want to dwell too much, but storage was really critical to a lot of our river basins this year. The importance of storage, again, I can't stress enough. This was kind of the poster child we had a relatively good year last year, not a banner year, but had a decent year where there was a lot of the reservoirs filled, used some of that, and then went into the year with good carryover storage. And so for basins like the Dolores and the Pine River and the Florida and the Mancos that had some storage, that's what got them through and maybe turned a crop and provided some municipal supplies. But that doesn't mean there haven't been major impacts. For one, now those reservoirs are all really at maybe dead pool, And so if we go into next year, it's going to be much, much worse if we don't get better snowpack. We've had a fire, and when this discussion first came up, there was a lot of emphasis on the fire, and I come back saying, drought isn't just about fire. That really highlights everything, and it brings it to people's attention. But we did have the 416 fire, and then the Burrow fire, and I guess it's the Plateau fire. And that really is representation of what the conditions are in all of the watersheds, that they're just ripe for these kind of catastrophes that could happen. The 416 fire, talked a little bit about yesterday, about 55,000 acres. Amazingly enough, we didn't lose houses. It was within a few feet of many houses, and we were lucky. And part of that, it was Mother Nature that took care of that for us. But in that fire in particular, with Mother Nature after that, and I think that Diane Mishbush touched on that this morning, we've had closures of the highways from mud flows that now are coming off of these fires and these watersheds, and then getting into the Animas River and getting into ditches that would like to be taking water and can't because of the debris. They try and close their head gates down, but some of it's flowing directly into the ditches, and these are going to be long-term problems that we're suffering with. So I touched on the fish kill on the Animas yesterday because of those flows off of these fire areas. One thing I didn't mention that when we had the discussion with the EPA and the Gold King mine, in the Gold King mine, we lost one fingerling trout that they can document because of those conditions on the mine spill. And that was really a test. They had them in a basket to test the water qualities and whether fish would survive. One fingerling out of 200 passed away, and they think it was just because of stress. But we've lost thousands and thousands of fish on one or two rain events now on the Animas. Going into conditions throughout, how that's impacted communities. The Animas is part of the supply for the city of Durango. Their primary supply is the Florida River that actually had difficulties in 2002 with the Missionary Ridge fire. They've mitigated most of those impacts. And so there's impacts to drinking water supplies for city of Durango. They do have Animas Plata water, but are lacking infrastructure to be able to use that. We have smaller domestic systems. For instance, the Lake Durango water system that has relied on diversions from the La Plata River that did not come into priority at all this year. Towns like Norwood, these areas that have small reservoirs and work cooperatively with irrigation companies are impacted and have had restrictions on for quite some time. Some of the bigger towns, not bigger, but for our part of the state, bigger towns like Pagosa Springs and Cortez have had some storage component that has got them through this year. But we don't know what the future is going to be. And so as far as changes in priorities, changes for the district, I think if you couple that with things we're dealing with now on Colorado River and looking at the projections that Lane talked about, we're very aware, and some of the priorities likely will be changing for our district. We're much more engaged, and it's just that's part of the statutory authority for our district in Colorado River issues, and we will continue to be there. And we're worried that discussions like drought contingency planning, demand management, we are worried about impacts to our communities in the future. And we will plan to be at the table and will continue to be at the table in the future in these discussions. And it is a statewide issue we're dealing with, and it should be a statewide solution. I think everybody recognizes we're connected by plumbing in the Colorado River system. You also mentioned, Brent, we've had a pretty extensive grant program. I think we will continue to have a grant program, but may not have the funding for that because some of our resources are shifting into some of these other needs on the legal end and the policy end. And then now we're coupling that with reductions in revenues because of Gallagher and the restrictions, because a lot of our tax base is from rural residences and not businesses. So we're on board, ready to go, and cautiously optimistic that we're going to have a better year next year on snowpack, and we'll talk more later in the panel.
Thank you, Bruce. Next question up for Andy. In your new role as general manager at the River District, you're new to a series of these statewide forums on water issues and Colorado River issues, working with the Basin Roundtables, speaking and participating like today at Water Congress, and joining the Interbasin Compact Committee. These roles necessitate sort of taking a statewide perspective on issues, and which the IBCC calls putting on your statewide hat. while still articulating the concerns of your constituents in your district. As you work with these interstate Colorado groups, how do you see the drought conditions on the Colorado that Lane mentioned sort of being reflected in these interstate conversations, working groups, and planning activities?
Well, thanks, Brent. You just mentioned the drought conditions. It's easy to continue to use that word drought, but just looking at this chart, which is still up in front of us but gone off the screens, but really since 2000, we've seen this new condition on the river, and it hit me today in particular as we sat here and looked at the bar graph. My 19-year-old daughter is in the crowd. She's never known anything different than that as I bring her back to college today. So that is the normal that she's used to. And I think that's the normal that we all have to be used to and plan for. And so in terms of our district and my role as the general manager, I actually think it's a fairly natural fit for someone in my position to think about things on a statewide level. And it has to do with our statutory charge, the same charge that Bruce just mentioned for Southwestern Conservation District, we have at the Colorado River Water Conservation District. And that is, yes, we have to and we will always look out for the interests of our residents in terms of their ability to protect, develop, and keep the water functioning for their benefit. But we also have this charge to protect the state's interests with respect to the state's allotment under the Colorado River Compact. And the River District has always taken that charge very seriously and continues to. And I would say that the interests of our district and the residents of our district are very much aligned with the interest of the state. When we look at these kind of charts and we look at the results of risk studies and we look at the modeling that our district has done, Southwest in our roundtables, others in the Upper Basin have done, we see lots of risks. And it's not just for our district, it's for the economic welfare of our state. And we're concerned about the entire state. And we're engaged in many different statewide discussions about how to creatively approach the future. Because we're convinced at the district, based on all the science we can find, that it's going to take very different approaches in the future. But for us, what that means is we have to, at the same time, protect the communities that depend upon the River District and on Southwest to hold their integrity together, their cultural character, their economic viability, the industries, the ag industries, the recreation industries, the tourism industries, and at the same time provide enough water within the system for the people within the state of Colorado, not just within our district. It will require, and it does require, frankly, right now, all of us at the state to recognize the values on both sides of that wall that Patty mentioned, that continental divide, and work cooperatively while recognizing the importance of, as Patty mentioned, urban landscape. We sometimes have a hard time recognizing that over on the West Slope. We need to recognize the value of that. We need, however, the Front Range water providers and Trans Mountain diverters to recognize the value that our agriculture brings to the entire economic benefit in the state of Colorado. Because our fear is that if we're not working cooperatively and openly and in a very informed manner as a state, and we're going to end up putting the West Slope agriculture as the sacrificial lamb on that altar of the Colorado River. And our belief is that will, in the short term, hurt the West Slope. In the long term, it will hurt the state. When people think of Colorado, they think of our lush, verdant valleys and our agricultural produce like the peaches sitting out on the table. They think of the communities and the towns that the tourists who start at DIA and come over the mountain on I-70. Sorry for any of you who have to drive back that way today, although it should be all right on Friday going this way. But that, all of that's connected, and getting an understanding and a joint value that Bruce and I, we have to recognize the people in Aurora, in Denver, need water. And frankly, it's the Colorado River that provides a tremendous amount of that water. We also have to recognize, and we would like them to recognize, the value of that on our side of the divide for the entire state. So I think we're doing a good job, and I think for me, I'm having a lot of fun in the process.
Thanks, Andy. So as mentioned a couple of times over the past few days, the CWCB, the Governor's Office, the Division of Water Resources, the Upper Colorado River Commission, and countless other Colorado water users and stakeholders, including everyone on this panel today, are engaged on this ongoing effort of drought contingency planning throughout the Colorado River Basin. And I'm going to return to Lane to provide an overview of those efforts to this point.
Thanks, Brent. I would like to preface these comments by saying that they do not reflect the official position or opinion of the Colorado Attorney General's office, but are my own. I have to say that. I have to say that. So what is drought contingency planning, and why are we doing it? To be frank, it's emergency response planning, so that we can reduce the risks associated with reaching critical elevations at Lakes Powell and Meade. Through 2026. So it's important to note this isn't a forever deal, it's a Band-Aid to try and get us through while we renegotiate the 07 guidelines. If these critical elevations are breached, the system faces threats to our ability to control our own destiny. It impacts drinking water supplies, irrigation, power generation, environmental resource conservation, and injects a very high level of uncertainty for municipal and agricultural water providers and those who rely on our recreation and tourism economies. The goal is to identify methods to provide additional security to the entire Colorado River system to address this unprecedented hydrology that we're experiencing and have been experiencing since 2000, so that we can ensure the continued operation pursuant to those 07 guidelines through their expiration in 2026, to join with the lower basin's drought contingency planning efforts to maximize the benefits for both of our basins, and to avoid uncoordinated and unilateral actions that are most likely to lead to conflict and litigation. It's a plan for a worst-case scenario, but it's important to remember that planning and preparation don't necessarily equate to implementation. In recognition of this, in 2014, the Upper Colorado River Commission adopted a resolution that outlined 3 elements to an upper basin drought contingency plan, and that is reoperation of the Colorado River Storage Project initial units, demand management, exploring options and feasibilities for development of demand management programs in the upper basin, and weather modification. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I'll just touch briefly on the first 2 elements. So the first one is the reoperation of those Colorado River Storage Project initial units. That's Glen Canyon Dam, Navajo Reservoir, the Aspinall Unit, and Flaming Gorge. And they're really, the key goal here is to reoperate those reservoirs to maintain the minimum power pool at Lake Powell, which is 3490. That's important because if Powell drops below that elevation, you're looking at a loss of power supply for millions of people. You're looking at a loss of funds for repayment of construction projects. An example would be, we have lots of participating projects throughout the upper basin. An example here in Colorado would be the Animas La Plata. And then operations and maintenance costs at these initial units every year, which their O&M is really rather expensive. The other consequences is that we would be at risk of falling out of compliance with the Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act, the Grand Canyon Protection Act, and because that compliance is achieved by reservoir operations pursuant to records of decision, again, it just really ups that level of uncertainty. And then last but not least, it really increases our risks of not being able to meet our compact obligations. The other component of that reoperation program would be to allow for recovery of storage lost. Once you draw down these large volumes of water in these reservoirs, it does take time to recover that storage. And so those are the main goals of the first component. But in recognition of the fact that this reoperation plan might not be enough and that we may be in need of a second line of defense, another tool in the toolbox, the UCRC's resolution also calls for exploring the feasibility of developing demand management programs in the upper basin. And this is, again, it's intended to boost levels at Lake Powell to support the upper basin's continued uses of its compact entitlements, to increase chances for compact compliance and avoid an involuntary curtailment. Per the UCRC resolution, demand management is defined as the temporary, voluntary, and compensated reduction of diversions to conserve water that would have otherwise been consumptively used when and if it is needed. As part of that resolution and this study, the UCRC is also charged with supporting each one of the Upper Basin states as they initiate their own intrastate investigations and studies as to the feasibility of demand management going forward. And that effort has recently been kicked off here in Colorado in the spring of this year, with CWCB engaging in a pretty extensive outreach and engagement initiative, and it will continue, and that's for the purposes of listening to stakeholders, water users throughout the state, to hear their concerns, get their questions, their feedback, so as to inform the state's position with regard to whether or not we proceed with standing up a demand management program. And I guess I would just like to end on and emphasize that study and that process does not necessarily mean that we would be implementing a demand management program.
Thank you, Lane. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how some of these planning efforts and some of the issues on the Big River affect our Colorado communities, and sort of the role that our water leaders within Colorado have in solving some of these problems and participating in the process. All the folks on this panel are not just leaders in the Colorado water community and within their districts, but they also serve in additional roles supporting state and Upper Colorado River Commission efforts throughout the basin. These roles allow our members of the panel to provide really good insight and input to these west-wide processes with the River Commission, with the Colorado River Water Users Association. But they also bring this information from these groups back to our local communities as a resource. This question is for anyone who wants to answer it over there, or all three of you, Lee, Bruce, and Andy. Lee serves on the committees of both the Colorado River Water Users Association and the Upper Colorado River Commission. Andy and Bruce serve as advisors to the Upper Colorado River Commission. And these roles are in addition to their actual day jobs, which is keeping their districts operational and rolling. Can you guys elaborate on the benefit this involvement in these sort of west-wide organizations brings to the citizens of your districts?
Sure. I think I can take a short stab at that and then pass it off. I would say that the information that we're able to garner and the input we're able to have as advisors to both our state's commissioner and to the UCRC. I can't speak to CRUA because we'll let Lee do that. But the idea being that we're able to get an understanding both of the perspectives and the strategies that other states in the Upper Basin as well as states in the Lower Basin may have with respect to their perspective on how water needs to be used within the Colorado River and how and why they would like it to be used more heavily in their state or in their particular area. It allows us to, again, at the River District, having both the internal and external role to make sure that the state of Colorado's river share is protected and available for use by all of the folks in the state. It also helps us look 10 to 20 to 30 years out for our own constituents within the district and help them have some certainty in the future and to help devise strategies and plans and be part of forming a drought contingency plan and looking at and evaluating and articulating the sideboards needed in a demand management program, if one's ever going to be stood up, that are necessary to protect the integrity of our water users. And it doesn't mean that our water users aren't going to have to change as we move forward. We understand that, but to do so in a way that is at least best calculated to ensure that all water users in the state continue to thrive. And that's really what that role allows us to do.
I guess I would probably say that what being part of the groups really does for our district is really comes into three categories: information, opportunity, and relationships. The first important part of being able to actually have a positive dialogue on addressing the issues that are really important to us is to have good information. By being part of these organizations, whether it's going to the meetings with CRUA or having an opportunity to see the interplay between the states at the Upper Colorado River Commission, you get the information so that you can assess and take back to the policy boards the kind of things that they need to understand so that they can make good decisions about management of the district. I think the second thing is the opportunity. A lot of going to these meetings means sitting quietly in the hallway, in the back of the room, listening, watching, understanding what's going on, and then when there's that opportunity to go up to one of the players, whether it's James Eklund or John Stolp or one of the staff people for CWCB, or quite frankly, some of the staff people for the other states' commissioners, to say, you know, you're looking at it here, but if you just take and move just a little bit, you'd really help out the interests of what we're doing with our project in Colorado. And it is, that's standing, you know, spending hours watching for the moments of opportunity to make things better for your district. And then finally, I think the most important thing, and this is why CRUA is so critical. And of course, you know, Colorado will be in the leadership this year. Jim Broderick, my boss, will be the president. So we're encouraging everyone to come to the Colorado River Water Users Association meeting in December. Please plan to come. This is going to be Colorado's feature year, the next 2 years. But you know, the relationships that you develop by going to the meetings, by talking to people in the hallway, by seeing them in the meetings, understanding what they do, who they are, where they fit into the whole thing, you can't get that opportunity if you don't understand the relationship and you don't have the relationships with the people. So that, I mean, I think more than any other thing, the relationships that you developed across state boundaries and within the state is really critical, and that's why being part of those groups is important for my district.
Thanks, Lee, and maybe a couple house cleaning things. McKinley, I promised I'd give a shout out from the panel up here. That's Andy's daughter, so good luck with your education. And you're one of the younger ones here. I'm sure we'll see you back in the future in some roles. So welcome, McKinley. And then the other thing I'd like to say, there's a disclaimer I have to make too. A lot of these are my personal opinions, but professional opinions when we're dealing with UCRC and cooperating with the state and the other states in planning. But some of these personal opinions when it comes to intrastate issues are also probably shared by my board. And our board has met jointly with the Colorado River District Board. Andy and I have gone back and forth to each other's meetings. So some of these may be my personal opinions, but they're not just my personal opinions. They're shared by our boards, our constituency, and our districts. So having said that, that's the disclaimer, Lane. I had to do one too, just didn't want to get left behind. I think as Lee and Andy have touched on, being a part of these other groups and being outside of the normal day-to-day operations of a district is important. And coordinating those efforts with our friends at the state government and folks that will be setting policy and administering, possibly administering compacts. Well, they do administer compacts in our area already. It's important to have those relationships as well as with folks in the other states. It does take sometimes time to develop those relationships, going to meetings like CRUA or the Colorado River Water Users Association for younger folks in the audience, and then the Upper Colorado River Commission, UCR. They're very educational, and it takes a number of years to build some knowledge base to understand these complex issues on the Colorado River. I agree with the modeling we've done on the risk study and other studies that have been done by the UCRC in the state. We're on heightened awareness about the levels of Lake Mead and Lake Powell, and having a drought contingency plan in place will be very important for all of the states. The lower basin is working on their own plan, and the upper basin is working on their own drought contingency plan. And the components that Lane touched on, for the upper basin, those are the three major components. And the one that probably is the most difficult to tackle is demand management. And for those that, most of you probably understand what demand management is, but for those that maybe this is your first time here or hearing these types of topics, this is a reduction in use. This is conservation measures potentially in municipalities, or this is taking land out of production in order to manage those demands and be able to use those conserved waters in some other way to keep us within compact compliance. I think that's an important part of what Lane touched on. was a voluntary program that folks could participate in, that we can hopefully use to rely on and keep us in compact compliance and not get into administration in the future. So voluntary, compensated, temporary are important sideboards to have in place in this state prior to the state inking a drought contingency plan. And that's what our district, our boards, I think jointly with the River District, have been stressing the importance of that. It's very consistent with what we're talking about today and it's presented to the Interim Water Committee, which you did a good job, Brent. That's a tough group sometimes. They ask tough questions. And so I think we're supportive. I know we're supportive of that. And we want to be a part of that discussion. I think also, I touched on earlier about it is a statewide issue. There are statewide uses of Colorado River water. Having geographic diversity in some way of the way those contributions are made on a voluntary compensated basis is also very important. And then touching on probably some of the things that Patty Wells touched on and Jim Lockhead has touched on and my attorney Beth Van Verst for the Southwestern District, it does rekindle some of these old relationships, some good, some bad. History is history, whether it's good or bad, it's all a part of history and will probably be a part of how we move forward. But in tough times like this, you have to get past that, and we have to learn to work together and do these types of contributions so that works for everybody. And making sure that in the future, if we have to go beyond that, that there's a way, an avenue to do that with everybody participating in that conversation.
Bruce, you gave me a great lead into my next question. I appreciate it. So Lane described the elements of this contemplated Upper Basin Drought Contingency Plan. So to set up a functional demand management program, if we as stakeholders and Coloradans decide that's the right thing, the Water Conservation Board has affirmed its commitment to work with our water users and to identify some of these challenges and opportunities that may be presented by a demand management program. To set that up, a deliberate and thorough analysis of any sort of impacts and the way that the program would function will be necessary to make sure this program respects prior appropriation and does no harm to downstream users. So as Colorado, the Upper Basin states, and the UCRC continue to explore whether a program would be operationally feasible, what do your boards and staffs identify as some of these challenges and opportunities that such a program would face to benefit all the citizens of Colorado that utilize this resource?
Well, I'll start with maybe the opportunity component because I want to be at least a little positive. I think the opportunity presented by demand management is that collectively, as a state and as the Upper Basin, we can proactively cooperate to avoid an administrative call on the Colorado River. And I think that's the benefit of exploring and actually implementing a program should we be able to do that. The risks that make my board and my staff and myself and Bruce's board, Bruce is right, our boards have the same charge. I'd say they haven't in their history always met anywhere near as frequently or as cooperatively and really in lockstep on issues as we are today. And really what we see is the extreme importance of setting a program up like this in a way that protects all water users in all communities. And in the West Slope, given our history and our size, we tend to be a little paranoid for a reason. And we aren't saying no, and that's really important. Our boards and together are not saying no, we're not going to participate in this. In fact, they've given Bruce and I and our staffs very clear direction. Get in there, talk about it, figure it out, see if you can make this work. Because they see the risks, they understand the concerns, and it's the concerns they have on a statewide basis that are causing us to be there. But we need the rest of the state who depends on the Colorado River to also see and act to protect all of the interests at the table. So the risks that we see are frankly, as I said before, the risk to the longevity and the integrity of West Slope Ag.
You'd like me to go? Lee wants the last word this time, understandably. Yeah, numbered. No, we're all together sharing the same views. I think there's some important points here today and some important points that came up yesterday in the Interim Water Committee. There was confusion about a demand management program that is intended to keep us within compact compliance on a voluntary basis, and the difference between mandatory curtailment. And I think, and my apologies to any of our legislators that may still be here, that was being mixed together yesterday, and it is difficult to understand, but right now we're talking about trying to avoid that compact curtailment. When we get in, if in the future, or if there are shortages, the upper basin, actually it's an upper basin requirement, is a number of years away from any kind of violation of compact. And so the idea is to look at it now, see if we can avoid that in the future. If it is a violation in the future for the upper basin, not just Colorado, Colorado has a priority system. That is the structure, as was mentioned this morning by one of our speakers, that's the basis of our Colorado water law. So that's something that will have to be incorporated into it. If you get into those types of things, I believe a state engineer has a lot of authorities for the administration of compact, having been a past division engineer, understands some of that. On some of the more difficult compacts, there are rules that would need to be adopted that would be incorporated into the priority system for the administration of those compacts. Again, I think the drought contingency plan that is talked about in the upper basin with all 4 states in agreement is to try and avoid getting to that point on a voluntary basis. So that's what we're supportive of. One of our concerns is if it's voluntary and doesn't have some sideboards on it, that the target will be West Slope agriculture and West Slope communities. And so we will try and avoid that. It has to be, I think, a contribution statewide.
So I think the key point here that we look at is that everything that we're doing in this particular venue is with a lot of uncertainty. It's, it's kind of like playing multi-level chess, except we don't know how many boards we have. And so we're trying to deal with a circumstance where on the one hand, we've got people who want to be assured that there's going to be no harm to them or that their objectives are going to be met. On the other hand, we don't know how any of their objectives actually fit into the overall scheme. I mean, we have the 7 basin states, we have the upper basin states issues, we have a number of different issues we're trying to address simultaneously without real clear understanding of what each of those things mean. So, as I've been thinking about this over a number of months that we've been in discussions about how do we get to a place, I think that, the key part of this is that we have to have a framework that's flexible, one that allows us to make changes. I think about the Northern District's agreement with Grand County. They call it the learning by doing. And I think that that in this particular circumstance, we're going to need some of that learning by doing. That's how we've been successful in the Arkansas. One of the reasons I talked about the voluntary flow management program or the winter water storage program. So this is that each of those programs were put in place in a temporary, one couple year basis while we figured all the pieces out. And we didn't lock down the structure so that we couldn't make changes if that's what we need. Now, we went in with a good structure. Winter water storage program actually ultimately got decreed pretty much the way that it got originally laid out. It had some tweaks, but it went in with essentially the structure that it had. The voluntary flow management program's a similar history. I think that, so we want to have a good structure, but when we start making demands and we start making bright lines, know this, know that, then we put ourselves in a very difficult position to be able to adjust in uncertain times. And I think that, trying to find that sweet spot, I've used that term, those of you who are familiar with the Arizona, trying to find that spot where we have enough certainty that people feel good about the program, but we're not locked down so far that we can't address the dynamic problems that we have in front of us. We don't know how long this drought's going to last. We didn't think the drought would last this long as it is. I mean, you take out a couple of years and The situation is, as Andy pointed out, since 2000 has been very different than what we said. Quite frankly, it's an interesting scenario as you think about the '07 guidelines in place. Quite frankly, the problem that we've encountered with the '07 guidelines is that the hydrology that we thought was the least likely outcome is exactly the hydrology we got. And so, again, it's that, how can we find the spot where we can allow everyone to achieve a reasonable amount of their objectives without setting bright lines so that we can adapt. I think that's going to be the real key. And until we start to work on that idea, I don't know that we're going to get to the finish line.
Thanks, guys. So the doomsday clock up here is ticking down pretty quickly, but we're going to do one more question for our three panelists.
Can we just, before you do
Go for it, Andy.
Some tweaked your interest?
It did. I just want to say I think Lee's got an excellent point, and I want to say that there are a history in Colorado River negotiations of people staking out very solid positions and being inflexible, and I think when you look at today's more collaborative nature, where we are actually throughout the state and throughout the basin meeting extremely frequently and talking, I think that it's important to recognize that there is so much uncertainty in our future with respect to what the hydrograph and the water supply looks like that we need to be flexible. But in being flexible, we also have to provide certainty to the greatest extent possible for water users throughout the state. And so there are ways to do that, and I think that the commitment by many people at the table to stay at the table and continue to communicate and participate in discussions, should the last 18, 19 years repeat themselves, it is solid from Bruce's district and my district, and I think the other partners at the table talking about this, the state, clearly Southeastern and the other Front Range interests. We all have to stay at that table and talk, and I think that's a commitment that our boards have made very clearly, and I think I appreciate hearing that from Lee, that flexibility, we're not going to solve it in 2018 for the next 30 years. We have to understand that we have to adapt in the future. So I would just say I agree with you, Lee. Sorry.
Can I ask my final question now? So by the next Summer Water Congress Conference, we'll have a new administration in place in Colorado. Over the past 8 years, Governor Hickenlooper sort of emphasized the importance of water policy and kicked off the basin implementation planning process and the Colorado's water plan process. With regard to the importance of the Colorado River system and these always in motion conversations about management of the resource, what words of wisdom would you share with the new administration regarding Colorado River priorities and policy?
Well, that's an interesting question because we heard some of the candidates speak, and I think there will be some education and hopefully some good advisors from this room that'll give advice to the new administration on where we go from here. We do have a water plan in place that took quite some time, a collaborative effort to develop, that has lots of great points in it. That includes multiple uses out there that are going to be important in this state, whether it's agriculture, municipal, or recreational or environmental type of supplies. I think it's going to take a reasonable approach to that. A balanced approach is going to be critical in the future. And also the recognition and hopefully some tools to address aging infrastructure issues we have in this state. As we heard from Denver and Patty Wells, if that infrastructure hadn't been put in place in this state by people that preceded us up on these types of forums, we wouldn't have the Colorado we have today. And I was born and raised in this state, and there's been many changes, some good, some not as good. But the water supply has been secure, and we're getting to a point now where maybe we're at some limits of our water supply, and we're going to have to get more creative about how we use the existing supplies we have. Some of that's going to be existing infrastructure, and some of that's going to be building new infrastructure out there, and there's some proposed throughout the state. So I think keep an open mind when you come in, take the opportunity to learn about water, and utilize the members of the Colorado Water Congress in your administration to give you advice on where to go. That's for the new administration.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question because most of the candidates come in with the belief that they've been elected because they're to lead and that they're supposed to have the answers or that their job is to forge answers. Quite frankly, with the water area, that's probably not the case. Most of them don't have the background in it, and so, I think one of the important parts for newly elected officials is going to be to have a little humility. You're going to have to know what you don't know. You're going to have to understand that even if you understand what is in place, it doesn't mean that you necessarily know how they got into place. And so how do you get that information? I mean, this organization is important, and individuals in this organization are very important. I mean, you've got the David Robbins of the world who's been through interstate litigation, has had a great deal of experience. You use that experience. You use the experience of the Jennifer Gimbles who have had leadership on the Colorado River for more than one state. In the circumstances, you bring the Bennett Rayleighs of the world who have had the time at the federal level and have seen how that federal interaction, how decisions get made. You've got to bring all that knowledge together. If you don't take advantage of those resources, then you're probably not going to be as successful as you necessarily want to be. And we're talking about spanning across party lines. Historically, water hasn't been a partisan issue. It's, you bring in the knowledge. And quite frankly, you've got to draw from that deep well of knowledge. A lot of people come in these days and they think that all the answers are on their smartphone and that anything that happened before the smartphone really isn't all that relevant. And I would tell any newly elected official, there's more to knowledge than what you can get off your smartphone. Go talk to the people. I had the distinct honor of having had the opportunity to work with Ray Moses as an intern. I worked with John Sayer at the beginning of my career. I worked with Sam Maines, who actually got yelled at by Sam Maines a lot. I mean, there are a lot.
He was right, though.
Almost. No, I mean, there were people who went before, and I had the honor of being able to actually hear from those people and learn from those people. And I would say that, I've worked at the federal level, the state level, and the local level, and if I hadn't had those people who I could draw from at the beginning of my career, I don't think that I'd be sitting here today.
I would just add two things. One, Lee hit on it, but you have to emphasize it. Water policy, water management does best when partisan politics stay out of it. In today's world, partisan politics are absolutely ripping our other parts of our community apart, and we cannot let that happen to the water community. And I would ask any of our statewide elected officials, newly elected officials, to remember that, and as hard as you want to fight for your party's goals, please remember that the water community is about our entire state's goals and not about one party. And then two, on the Colorado River in particular, yes, we need more infrastructure and reservoirs to help us regulate variable flows, but you cannot build our way out of the current hydrology. So building reservoirs and infrastructure is necessary, but it is not the only solution.
Well, thank you to you all for listening to us talk today, and please join me in thanking our panelists.